Well, welcome everyone, and thank you again for joining. This webinar is presented by the Woodlands Partnership of Northwest Massachusetts, and our theme today is Climate Change and Forest Management 101. And we'll welcome our speaker very shortly. My name is Lisa Hayden, and I'm Outreach Manager for New England Forestry Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization and regional land trust focused on conserving forests and advancing exemplary forestry to sustain people, protect wildlife habitat, and respond to climate change. And I'm hosting today in my liaison role as administrative agent for the Woodlands Partnership of Northwest Massachusetts. This is a consortium serving this most forested corner of the Commonwealth. And you may have heard of the organization as the Mohawk Trail Woodlands Partnership, but the board has adopted its new name as of last October. And if you're not familiar, the mission of the Woodlands Partnership is threefold. First, promoting conservation of the diverse forests of this 21-town region in northern Berkshire and western Franklin counties, and supporting their ecosystem functions amidst a changing climate. Secondly, supporting natural resource-based and sustainable economic development for the region. And third, advocating for the municipalities of this very rural region in maintaining services for their communities. Now, also assisting today from NEF, we have Executive Assistant Megan Gayader and Partnership Assistant Sovi Argett-Singer, and I want to thank them for all their help with the logistics today. And just in terms of logistics, we have a large group today, so attendees will be muted. But as noted, please, you're welcome to enter comments or questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to all of those at the end of the talk. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the video will be shared in a follow-up email. And before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to just turn briefly to Kate Lindros Conlin to say hello on behalf of the Partnership Board.
Hi. I'm the chair of the Education, Outreach, and Research Committee, which is hosting this webinar. I invite you all to another webinar we are hosting happening next week, February 2nd at noon, titled Waste or Resource, a panel discussion on wood residue. Joining this discussion will be Ben Cargery of Williams College, who will share findings from his study on how wood residue is being handled in the Northwest Massachusetts region, Sean Mahoney of the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Emily Boss of the Massachusetts Woodlands Institute, Jay Healy of Hall Tavern Farm, and Andre Strong Bear Hart Gaines Jr., a citizen of the Nipmuc people. Thank you all for being here, and I'm really excited to hear Ali speak.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And so now for the main event, I will introduce our speaker, Alexandra Kosiba, who goes by Ali for short. Welcome, Ali. So Ali is a forest ecophysiologist and extension assistant professor of forestry at the University of Vermont. As the extension forester, she creates resources and conducts applied research to help woodland owners, foresters, and decision makers better understand the impacts of climate change and other stressors on Vermont's forests and management techniques to improve forest resilience. A licensed forester, Ali serves as a regional educator on forest carbon science and management and is state lead on the Vermont Forest Carbon Inventory. She also works on various forest health topics like planning and management for at-risk tree species, land planning for maintaining critical forest services, and forest monitoring. And before coming to UVM, she was the climate forester for the state of Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, and also notably the first climate forester in the nation. So we're really pleased to have Ali with us today, and you've got your slides ready, so take it away.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
Welcome.
And thanks everyone for showing up and your interest in hearing about climate change and forests. So I think it probably comes as no surprise to folks in the audience that our climate is changing. And these are graphics I pulled for Massachusetts, and they show overall from long-term climatological records that the average air temperature has increased 3.5 degrees since late 1800s. And you can see this is the figure on the left. Of course, there's year-to-year variation in that air temperature, but the blue line is that long-term trend. And then average annual precipitation has also increased about 7 inches in that same time period. So these are pretty significant changes over the last 125 years. And this means a lot of different things for forests. First of all, temperature drives biological activity and drives where species exist. And certainly increases in precipitation are going to change sort of water availability. And we know that more precipitation is coming in what we call heavy rainfall events. So these might be 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch rainfall events, and not necessarily coming equally over the year. And these heavy rainfall events, they can physically wash away leaf litter that covers the soil, protects roots. Soil nutrients can actually be depleted in these events. And of course, when we talk about infrastructure, that we have roads and trails, heavy rainfall events can cause havoc and erosion, which then can affect downstream water quality, which is a big concern. And even though we're seeing this increased precipitation, it's coming sort of in spurts, heavy events, and then there might be bigger time periods between rainfall events. So we are forecasting that there is going to be likely more increase in drought, and that is coupled with our higher temperature. Higher temperature really, it's a thing that causes more evaporation. So water evaporates from the leaves of trees and other plants, from soil, other surfaces, and warm air can hold more water. So we project that soils might exhibit more drying. And this is going to be really patchy throughout our region. We have a lot of different soil conditions, depth of soil, water availability. And so it's really hard to predict and project what might happen here. Droughts are particularly problematic, as you might imagine, for seedlings that have very shallow roots and are getting established. Most dominant large trees can withstand droughts pretty well. They store a lot of water in their stem and in their roots, and they are able to tap and access sort of deeper water reserves. And so that's where we are most concerned is in that new generation of seedlings and saplings. We're also thinking that there's likely going to be a greater possibility of what we call severe disturbance events. Things like ice storms, where the temperature might not be cold enough for that precipitation to come as snow, or maybe the surfaces of trees are warm and then the temperature changes, and we get things like ice loading that breaks branches, topple trees, or even bends small trees over, like in that top picture. And often those trees really don't recover from that event. The tree rings actually sort of break apart. The trees will survive, but they're usually damaged from that event. And then also things like windstorms. So we might see more blowdowns, tip-ups, breakages of trees. And a lot of this is really hard for us to project and predict in climate models because these occur very infrequently. They're patchy with our topography and sort of the nature of weather events in New England. But that's sort of the general projection, is that we might see more of these and they'll be more severe. And certainly this winter, well, things have changed a little bit, but this winter is a good example of how warmer winters may lead to a lower snowpack. And why we care about snow, we care about it for a few reasons. It really acts as sort of insulative blanket on soils, and it protects roots. And so we've seen from research in the region is when there isn't snow, you actually get deeper soil freezing because it doesn't have the insulative protective barrier. And certainly snow is really important for a lot of other ecological functions in the forest. Movement of small animals, we call it the subnivean zone. So that's really critical for a lot of animals for nesting and sort of places to hide in the winter, right? Like grouse use snowpack. And of course, snowmelt is an important provider of spring moisture when trees are becoming active and leafing out. We also think there's just going to be more sort of wacky weather events, is what I'm calling them. And these are things, it's an example of photos of sugar maple. These are a couple different events that I've captured over the years where we have a really warm spring. So the trees come out of dormancy, they start leafing out. Sugar maple is a very early leafer outer. And what happens is sometimes we get a late spring frost, and those leaves are really sensitive to that cold damage. And you can see in that top right picture, they get misshapen, the edges, the margins of the leaves will get damaged. So they won't be as robust, as big. That means the tree isn't able to photosynthesize as much. Sometimes these trees will actually push out a new batch of leaves a little bit later in the spring, and that's a huge carbon resource loss for the tree. They can usually handle that, that's fine. But as we see these events happening with more frequency, that's when we become concerned. And of course, we think that other stressors are going to benefit from climate change. Our forests experience many other stressors in addition to climate change, and some of these might actually change in their dynamics with a changing climate. So, for example, insects, one notable example, actually not pictured here, is hemlock woolly adelgid that affects hemlock trees. Right now, it's really limited by cold winter temperatures. As our winters get warmer, we project that that species will sort of expand in range and potentially cause more damage. Certainly things like foliar diseases of trees will benefit from a wetter, warmer climate. That's what disease is like. We're not really sure how earthworms will respond to changing climate. All of our earthworms in our region are non-native. Most are European origin. We now have what we call the crazy snake worm that's from Asia. All of those are not native. They were introduced and they churn through the nutrients in a forest really fast. Certainly invasive plants, we think, will benefit from a changing climate. They're invasive because they can take advantage of opportunities, and we think they'll probably take advantage of a longer growing season and a warmer climate. And then deer browse is a big problem throughout our region here in Vermont. I know in Massachusetts as well. And deer are one of those species we think, unlike moose, will probably benefit from a changing climate. We call climate change a threat multiplier because of those interactive effects between these other stressors and the climate. And so this climate change and all these other stressors are also happening on a legacy of land use in our region. So we had widespread land clearing in the 1800s. A lot of our forests in many of our states, you can see in that graph at the top, were cleared mostly for agriculture, also of course for settlements, houses and development and whatnot. We had farm abandonment, and a lot of those forests were permitted to just regrow. And it's an amazing testament to our forest resilience here, is that the forests we look out upon were not here, 100 years ago, most of them, and they're what we call second growth. And in that amount of time, we've recovered a substantial amount of our forest cover. But some of these places were grazed with animals. Many of them might have been plowed, so the soils were disturbed. Often they were high graded, which means the best trees were selected for removal, for timber. There's unsustainable harvesting techniques. We learned a lot about ecology and how to manage forests in that time. At that time, people were just looking for opportunistic ways to reap money from the forest, and they didn't incorporate much of ecological functioning as we do now. And we've also had sort of another stressor that's really hard to visualize, but we've had decades of air pollution and acid rain. Luckily, that's improved with policy regulations, but that left a long legacy in our forests and in our forest soils in particular. So what this has resulted in many of our forests here in New England have altered and simplified species composition. So it might only be one species, and really all forests, even forests that we think of as dominated by one species, would have more than one species in them. They would have some species diversity naturally as part of them. They have what we call simplified physical structure, so maybe only one age class of trees, not different sizes of trees or different conditions. We want to, emulate what would be natural in a forest, which would be this structure that would vary vertically and horizontally. So we'd have dead trees, live trees, trees of different sizes, gaps in the canopy. And we have things like degraded soil, altered soil, degraded stand conditions, sometimes from logging that happened, like in the lower right photo. Often some logging has caused residual damage to trees. We have less deadwood in our forests because of these land use practices, particularly in places that were used for agriculture. That deadwood was in the way and has been removed. But deadwood takes a long process to establish in a forest. It requires trees to die or branches to break, and that can take time. And our forests are very young. And so if we look around our forests, they often have less deadwood than they would have had they been old growth forests. And what we call this sort of generally is we have landscape homogenization. And that just means we have more similarity across our landscape than we would have if natural processes and disturbances had been allowed to occur. So we sort of combine these stressors with these legacies of past land use, the stressors that our forests face, invasive plants, invasive insects and diseases, deer browse, and we add climate change, and we have set up a situation that we potentially have less resilient forests in the future. I'm going to talk how we can address this, because we do have this new form of forestry a lot of us are thinking about to incorporate ecological principles and climate change into how we think about and manage our forests. So the goals are to really reduce vulnerabilities and advance resilience. And I'll talk about what those mean, but this includes sustainable forest management, also includes conservation and preservation of locations and specific features, and restoration to improve resilience in these stands. So vulnerability is the degree at which a forest is susceptible and unable to recover from climate change. And so we know that certain forest conditions, disturbances that forest face can make a forest more or less vulnerable to these climate change impacts. And then resilience is what we're striving for, is the ability of a forest to recover or adapt following a disturbance or change. It might look different, it might have different species or different structure, but the forest and what it provides are still there and continue. And so we have sort of this spectrum in our forests, and it really points to no one strategy fits every stand in every forest. And really, it's about assessing the stand conditions, the site conditions, what is presently out in the forest, what possible past land use histories have led to those current conditions, and then the vulnerabilities, right? So it's the spectrum of potentially fewer vulnerabilities to more, and that's a spectrum also that aligns with sort of the management techniques and the amount of interventions that stand might need to increase that vulnerability. So things I've mentioned already, but presence of invasive plants, particularly populations that are expanding in size or really outcompeting the development of native herbaceous plants, seedlings, et cetera, in the forest, a lack of species diversity, or what we call structural complexity. So this is that horizontal, so from side to side, and vertical, up and down, heterogeneity. So that just means variation in the forest. We want sort of no conditions to be variable, and that would mimic what a forest would look like with natural stand processes. Certainly things like, as I've mentioned, a lack of deadwood or limited deadwood, a limit of age class diversity, or really load regeneration, which is really a problem through a lot of our forests. When we look out into the forest, there's often a significant lack in those younger age classes that are going to be the future forest. Things like extensive animal browse, and then this sort of unhealthy damaged trees with small crowns, like the example on the right, very close spacing, trees that are not growing well very much. They have very small crowns, so that's the foliage. The top of the tree is a small percentage of the actual tree. And then things that have affected the soil, so a lack of leaf litter, altered soil conditions that have been tilled or managed in a way, and earthworms. And so the goal of climate adaptive forestry is really to maintain the ecosystem services that forest provides through sort of this iterative approach of assessing those conditions and vulnerabilities, using techniques to reduce those vulnerabilities if they're present, increasing resilience, and then also having this plan for the unexpected. We don't know exactly what climate change will bring. And so monitoring and evaluating and reassessing sort of the long-term plan for the forest stand as things change and as different disturbances are encountered. And of course, forests provide us, many really critical ecosystem services and benefits. And this is a goal, is that we want to maintain these in the future. And certainly climate mitigation of forests has received a lot of attention recently, which is great that people are recognizing the role of forests in a global perspective. And climate mitigation is carbon. That's what we're talking about here. And the concept here is that trees can help mitigate, so reduce the effects of climate change by sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then they store that carbon in their wood, so in their trunks and their leaves, their branches, the roots, and that carbon gets transferred eventually into dead wood and then the soil. And so there are two terms that are talked about when we talk about carbon, and sometimes they get confused or used interchangeably, but really we're talking about carbon storage, which is the amount of carbon in something. I use the analogy of the bank account. This is the amount of money you have in your bank account. So this could be a single tree, acre of forest, piece of lumber, cubic yard of soil, etc. And then carbon sequestration is that process of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in the wood or soil. And you can think of it as the opposite of emissions. Forests also emit carbon dioxide. I'll talk about that too. But carbon sequestration is this, your deposits into that bank account. And so the rate might vary over time. Some months you deposit more, some months you deposit less, but it's that taking out and depositing, and your storage increases by the amount you sequester. In our region, so this is for the whole Northeast, so I do have New York in here, so New England and New York. Our forests store a heck of a lot of carbon. We are very lucky. We have a lot of forests. Right now, and I should update these data, we're a little bit lagged with how we get data from for carbon, and these come from long-term monitoring plots by the U.S. Forest Service that are scattered throughout our region. And so our forests store what is the equivalent of 54 years of our region's annual greenhouse gas emissions. So if we lost all of our forests right now, it would be 54 years of emissions from driving cars, heating our homes, industrial processes, etc. And so that's about 17.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. And you can see that varies by state. We all have different sizes, different amounts of forests. But if we look at it on an acre basis on the bottom, pretty similar across our states, a little less than 400 metric tons per acre. When we look at the sequestration, this tells us the annual rate that carbon is taken out and being stored. So we call our forests a carbon sink because they're taking out more and more carbon from the atmosphere every year. And that differs from some other states. If you look at states out west where there are widespread catastrophic fires, many of those states have forests that are carbon sources. That means that they're emitting more through that process of fire than they're taking out of the atmosphere. And so our forests here sequestered about 53 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in 2018. And again, on average, when you look at an average acre, there's, it's pretty similar. There's some differences by state. We have different forest types, management regimes or management that's used, and different climates too. So that really affects sort of these sequestration rates. And when we compare that annual sequestration to the amount of emissions that we all produce each year, it's about 14% of our annual emissions. So not quite, that 100%, they're not quite covering everything, but they're doing a lot for us, which is incredible. And I will say this number does not include losses from forest land conversion, which we are all experiencing across our states, and doesn't include storage of carbon in wood products. So we know that deforestation and forest conversion, so the clearing of forests for other uses, particularly now we're seeing it not for agriculture, but for development, that we lose the carbon that's stored in that forest. And the other problem is that that land now does not contribute to annual sequestration now or in the future. And so we call this foregone sequestration, but sort of chips away, every acre that we lose chips away at that power of our collective forests to mitigate some of our greenhouse gas emissions. And then also importantly, harvested wood products, which I imagine, most all of us are, near wood right now in our homes, desks, chairs, floors, things like that. Those are all storing carbon, stores carbon for as long as it's used, sometimes even longer, depending on what happens with that wood after. It can be recycled or reused. And importantly, can replace the use of other non-local products and energy-intensive products like steel, concrete, and fossil fuels, which make plastics and other products. When we talk about carbon, it's important to think about it. It's a cycle, right? It's not static, constantly moving around the forest. And we do talk about it in these different pools because that can kind of help understand how it moves and where it's stored and for longer amounts of time. And we have these, the main pool is the trees. That's where carbon is coming in through active photosynthesis. But as leaves are shed from those trees, as trees die or branches break, that carbon gets transferred into different carbon pools. So the litter pool, the deadwood pool, and eventually makes its way as it decomposes and other processes into the soil pool. And when we look at these proportions for our region, so the top pie chart is sequestration. That's a rate of carbon accumulation. Most of that, more than 3/4 is coming from trees. It makes sense. That's where they're pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but it's very slow for it to get into those other pools. And I mentioned earlier that, the process of creating deadwood, building up soil takes time. It requires trees to die, be decomposed by bacteria and fungi and all the other detritivores we have in our forests. But we look at storage, that's the amount of carbon in these different pools. Soil is a clear winner here. So our soils are storing more than half of the carbon in our forests. And carbon in soil can be stored potentially for hundreds of years, if not even some research has shown thousands of years in our region. And it really varies. Some of the carbon turns over very quickly, but some can get locked away for long periods of time. And at each one of these pools, we have emissions. So these are just natural processes, little red squiggly arrows going up in the air are attempt to illustrate that. And that's natural. These are natural biological processes. All of the cells that are living need energy, and they release carbon dioxide when they use energy. And there's decomposition and decay that releases carbon dioxide. And so when we have an input of carbon dioxide into trees, not all of it makes its way eventually into the soil. And I mentioned when we have active management, we do have another pool that comes from the live trees, and that's in harvested wood. And so this mitigation effect of a forest really depends on this delicate balance between uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release or emissions. And these are affected by so many factors in our forest. So the site characteristics, the tree characteristics, their age and health, productivity, and really importantly, things like the climate and disturbances and stressors, as well as management. So we can sort of tweak these with forest management and think about how to sequester more or flux carbon into different pools. We know that disturbances and other stressors can change this balance, and this is really natural in forests. We have things like blowdowns that will cause trees to die and create more deadwood, right? And so we'll have a situation where sequestration goes down and decomposition goes up. Things that can reduce the ability of trees to photosynthesize, like in this photo with maple leaf cutter that reduces the leaf area. You have things, as I mentioned, fire is really a release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And then certainly when we remove timber from the woods, that is carbon. The thing here that's nuanced is that some of that carbon will get put into durable wood products, so not released. And then also, as long as this forest is allowed to remain forest, new trees will begin to grow up, or trees that are there will expand into the gaps, and you'll get active and rapid sequestration. So those two terms, carbon sink, sort of net absorber of CO2, where sequestration is greater than emissions, carbon source is the opposite. But really these terms depend on both the spatial constraints, so how big of a space we're talking about, and over what time frame. So sometimes in the conversation on carbon, this can get really confusing, because if we look at one point in time, it will tell us something different. If we look at one spatial scale, it will tell us something different. So to illustrate that, so say we have this one stand, the carbon will fluctuate. Maybe there was a disturbance, a blowdown that caused a loss of live trees. Maybe there was forest management. But you can see if we look at a short time frame between these 2 points, we'd see a loss of carbon. But if we look at a longer time frame or a different time frame, we can see a gain. So it really does depend on what time frame we're talking about. And forests take, they move at a different rate than we do as humans. We call it forest time in the forestry community. And so we need to keep that in mind, that things are not going to be immediate. And so when things happen in the woods, there'll be a recovery period. And certainly when we talk about spatial scale, we have this one stand, but that's part of a larger landscape. And so at periods of time when this is rapidly sequestering carbon, maybe another stand had a disturbance and is emitting, or vice versa. And we look at this over a landscape, like over a state level, and we have a much more leveled out carbon flux. Carbon storage and sequestration peak at different phases in forest stand development. And so this is really important to understand. This is just a schematic. This is showing an example of a maple beech birch forest, but it's a general rule of thumb. Not every stand will match this process, but really, so we have carbon storage on the left side, and you have stand age. So as that stand develops, we have an increase in carbon storage over time. The trees are getting bigger. There's more complexity in that forest as it gets older. The soils are building up. The litter layer in the forest floor is building up. Dead wood builds up as the processes are allowed to occur. But when we look at sequestration, which I've called carbon flux here because we have sequestration on the bottom, which we depict as a negative number because it's taking out of the atmosphere. We can see that as a younger stand, so bigger negative numbers, this is showing an example about 20 years, the stand is showing peak sequestration. And really that's just because the trees are actively competing with each other. They're trying to grow tall at that point and grow as tall as they can. And it's really, the stand will be really dense and it hasn't gone through some of the processes where some trees are just going to naturally die because there's not enough space and that complexity hasn't got there. So when we look at, this is an example of the age distribution this is actually for Massachusetts forest. It's showing the current age distribution across the state. And you can see most of forests in Massachusetts are, around the sort of 70 to 100-year age range, very similar to our forests here in Vermont. And, if we, we can see that in 25 years, we'll have more carbon storage. The sequestration, all things being equal, if we progress that forward, would decline. And that's just a natural process that happens as these forests sort of develop and age. And so while older forests can store more carbon, it's important to recognize on a per stand, per forest basis, there are a lot of different trajectories that a forest can show. That was sort of the, a schematic idealized example, but there can be these partial disturbances that occur from blowdowns, wind, insects, different disturbances that occur, and really depends on a lot of factors in that specific forest, and including things like pests and pathogens, disturbances, and now we have climate change, of course. So not every stand will accrue maximum carbon stocks because of these vulnerabilities. And so many stands, it will take a long time, and there might be these carbon fluctuations along the way. So examples are, invasive plant species that are limiting a future forest, or relics from past land use. Certainly the top image is a common occurrence in a lot of our forests, which is beech sprouting from beech leaf disease that outcompetes any other species regenerating. And for us to have forests to help us to mitigate climate change, it's important to think about the carbon now, but it's more important that we think about the carbon into the future. So we want them to store and sequester carbon dioxide well into the future for the best benefits from these forests. And so how can we do this? How can we store more carbon now and also emit less? And there's really been this dichotomy of two different strategies, but I do want to stress and make a point that we can combine these when we think about forest management. So the first has been one called passive management. This is sort of the do nothing or at least no timber harvest approach. And really the goal here is to maximize carbon storage in the forest. And this is great for promoting other goals. I think that's really, for old forests, preserving old forests, biodiversity goals, or refugia, which are these places we think might be buffered from climate change. But really, it's critical to recognize, depending on the site characteristics, it may not be a good fit for all sites and all forest conditions. And certainly, if those vulnerabilities are present, will not advance forest resilience, at least in the short term. It may take hundreds of years. And one thing that we're concerned with, and I'm certainly concerned with, is this term leakage that we need to be thoughtful about. And I'll talk about this at the end. But this is that idea that when we reduce harvest in one place, the market demand is there, and harvest will just happen elsewhere. And that can mean that those carbon benefits actually are just negated because the harvest happens elsewhere. And sometimes it happens in places where it has less regulation on environmental output, environmental conditions and human rights conditions. And so we need to be really thoughtful about what that means in our society. And then there's active management. And the goal here really should be to promote healthy, vigorous trees to sequester carbon, right? So they can actively be pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. It does also allow us to transfer carbon from the live tree pool to some of the other pools, like the dead wood or harvested wood products. And it is an opportunity we can use to improve forest resilience as well as community resilience with having a local wood economy, local jobs, and keeping the forests as forests. And it's a good option for forests that need rehabilitation, restoration, or they lack these qualities of what we consider a healthy forest. And so climate adaptive forestry can be a tool, a lens with which to do this, to create complexity, so that variation in our forests, increase the diversity of species presence, enhance ecological features, wildlife habitats. And also, as I mentioned, we can have things that are passive management. So designating reserves. So those are areas that we leave and we never cut, right? And those or things we call legacies. So these are large, big trees that we let live their full life out in the woods. It allows us to sustainably harvest resources, a local source of resources, We can flux carbon into these different pools. And I would suggest that this allows us to have more resilient forest carbon. So we're not just focusing on maximizing sequestration or storage, but we're thinking about the future of carbon and the health of these forests in the ecological systems that they exist. And, another reality in our woods for a lot of our lands owned by family forest landowners is that selling timber, because of the economics, may be necessary to fund restoration work and to keep forests in their ownership, right? A lot of this work will cost money. The landowner will have to pay unless they have a way to maybe harvest in another part of their woods. While the crew is there, they can do some of this restoration work. So, examples in the top right, really common in a lot of our woods, old logging roads that were put in places that were very steep, not closed out properly, sources of erosion. And that will take work to fix that and cost money. Invasive plant removal is pretty laborious and costs money. And the middle photo is really cool work that's being done in Vermont, and I'm sure elsewhere, called strategic woody additions, which is this idea that we have a lot of streams that have been what we call incised. So the banks have dropped because a lot of water has run through after land clearing that we experienced. And we want to restore them to their more healthy conditions for cold water fisheries, but also flood resilience, nutrient retention. And strategically using wood in these streams can help do that. But again, this is very laborious work and it costs money. So pairing this with an active timber sale can be a way for the landowner to actually fund this work. And I mentioned leakage, and this is funny because I'm a forest ecologist and not an economist, but more and more I'm concerned with how we use resources in our region and where we're getting them from. And this graph is from a paper in Prep by Caitlin Littlefield, Tony D'Amato, Paul Catanzaro, David Foster, and perhaps others, I don't know, but showing consumption in each state. So that's a wood used, that's in the black bars, versus removal, so harvest from those states' forests. And you can see for all of our states except Maine, we're consuming more than we're removing. And looking at Massachusetts, that difference is quite large. And for all of our states, we have robust forest resources where we can harvest sustainably. We have more wood that we could harvest. And so when we don't use resources that come here, where are those resources coming from and at what cost? And really the question is there a mitigation benefit? What does the atmosphere see? If we're harvesting from elsewhere, then transporting those products from New Zealand, there's a big carbon cost in that. And so the benefits might not be there. And certainly there's some bigger picture issues with justice and environmental impacts. And so I really think we need to be thoughtful in considering what these changes would mean. And, I'm also interested in this correlation between changing harvest rates in our states and potentially loss of forests. All of our states are now losing forest cover, as I mentioned, and this is not really because of agriculture anymore. It's mostly because of development. And so we need to think carefully about the economics of keeping forests as forests. A lot of our states are seeing an increase in solar panels from clearing in cleared forests as well. And of course, solar panels are great, but thinking about that trade-off of where we're having impacts and where we want to keep forests. And so this is something I'm very concerned about as we chip away at the potential of our forests. We chip away at all those resources, those economic values that they provide, including carbon, but all the other wonderful benefits that they provide us. I think that's all I got. Here's my email address if you want to follow up about anything. I always love talking to folks, and we'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Allie. That was wonderful. Great overview. We do have some questions that have come in, and one of them was submitted actually beforehand, so I'll go to that one first from Laura. And you did touch on some of this, but her question was about how to manage forests for the most carbon sequestration, and specifically what resources exist to help quantify carbon storing, and particularly for towns that want to begin to understand the impact of, their different forest areas and those that are managed or harvested.
Yeah, so touched on this in the presentation, but thinking about carbon, thinking about healthy, productive forests. And so I think that's really the goal, is reducing those vulnerabilities to have sequestration in the long term, but recognizing that, anytime we've sort of had management where we focus on one goal over the other, sometimes that can have maladaptive or poor outcomes. And so having multiple goals is really, the best way to view forests, and that's sort of more holistic. And so managing with sequestration, having that resilience paired with that. As far as resources and quantifying carbon, boy, quantifying carbon is very challenging because of the nuances in our forests. It's pretty messy. What we do is basically measure trees and then extrapolate out using equations. And so there's a lot of error and a lot of uncertainty in it. Soils are even harder for us to quantify the carbon. They're quite variable over space. And you can think about soils are very different in depth, different materials. So soil is very hard for us to estimate. There is a good tool by the Nature Conservancy, Resilient Lands Mapper, I think. And it's an online tool, and you go to it and it has the entire United States, and you can actually look at areas. You can upload or draw a little polygon, and make sure you click carbon. There's a little box that says carbon, and it will produce the carbon estimates. They are estimates. And so take them with a grain of salt, but it gives you a sense of sort of where the storage and sequestration is for a parcel or a stand.
Great. And of course, if a town is thinking about carbon credits or the markets, then that's a very specific protocol, right, for measuring for those purposes. And you work with a forester, I assume?
Yes, and I'm part of a group called Securing Northeast Forest Carbon. If you Google that, you can find, we have a website and a lot of resources on there. So we cover kind of forest carbon, and there's actually, I gave a series of webinars for foresters, and they're all in there. If you want to really get in depth on carbon, they're each an hour and a half. And we also have a panel from carbon offset or carbon program developers. And we created sort of a table that sort of outlines those programs, sort of minimum acreage, what you might expect to make from those, but they all have they're sort of hard to talk about in one because they're all very different. I'm happy to talk to folks, especially I know that question came from Vermont, and I'm happy to talk to folks more specifically about any of those.
Okay. Great. Yeah, and we can hopefully share some links in our follow-up when we distribute the video too. So thank you for that question. So next, there is one from Garth. How does burning a cord of blow down wood as a heat source affect the carbon equation as opposed to letting the wood decompose?
Yeah, so this gets to sort of detailed carbon accounting. I burn with wood. It does release carbon dioxide. That's what burning wood does. It's also, the only energy source that I can, go out and harvest without any technology, buy from my logger neighbor. So that's a really important benefit. When we look at the balance between energy sources, certainly things like electrified energy with solar is becoming much more, has a lower carbon footprint. As far as leaving, the benefits of burning versus leaving the wood, that's again, it depends on what that wood's replacing and the value of having a heat source that's locally. Some of these things are hard to put into the carbon equation. When we talk about forest management, we're encouraging landowners and foresters to think about increasing that dead wood. And some of that might be, removed for firewood purposes, and that helps keep that, it might help fund that restoration work, right? Or it might help that logger make money and be able to continue being a logger. And so it gets a little bit more complicated when we sort of want to make these balances because there are a lot of other parts, we interact with these forests, and it's a little bit more complex and sort of like summing up the carbon emissions and carbon balances. And so we want to kind of have it all, I guess, leave more deadwood is great if it can happen in your woods.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, looking through the comments here, let's see, might be Cosmo, I'm not sure the name, but a question just about the below ground. The soil contains more than 50% of carbon, he's kind of quoting. That excludes the below ground living biomass, soil, microbes, roots, etc. Is this correct?
It only excludes roots, living roots. So the soil biomass does, I believe, it sort of varies in how people measure it. But yeah, I think it will include mycorrhizae, so fungi and other parts of that soil community. But the living roots of trees are excluded. That's in that below ground live biomass. And a lot of this comes down to how we compute these different pools. We use the above ground portion of a tree to estimate the roots. We have the sort of ratios that we can use to compute that. But then the soil will include like everything else, and it includes dead roots. So we have a lot of turnover of roots from trees. They have big roots, but they also have these very fine feeder roots, and those turn over within a year or certainly a year, and then they become part of the soil pool. So in that soil pool, you can have sort of dead biotic material, live biotic material from organisms, and also you can have different inorganic carbon in there. So very complex system in our soils.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so Chris, okay, here's a question. He's like, he understands the carbon cycle, but wants to learn more about how to get more organic soils, those previously stripped by farms, faster. We want to learn which species to grow for healthiest ecosystem. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, the differences between species are probably somewhat minimal. It really depends on the site conditions. So we do have differences by sort of forest type. And that is a combined difference, really comes down to sort of our evergreen species versus our deciduous species, because our deciduous species have leaves that decompose quite quickly. Our evergreen species, so particularly like spruces, fir, pines, you probably have seen this in forests. They have a very deep litter layer, and you can actually see the needles that have been dropped, and they take a long time to decompose. And so conifer forests have pretty deep litter layers and deep organic layers. And so that is one, difference between forest types is between that how quickly that leaf litter gets processed and used by, because there's all sorts of organisms that are eating those leaves, they're using them for their own energy and breaking them apart. As far as managing for soil carbon, really healthy, productive forests are the best way. And it really, it takes a long time to build up soils. And there's not really an easy fix. There's some studies that have looked to, if we can we increase the litter inputs? That actually hasn't shown to really increase the soil carbon, because it often then increases the population of organisms that eat those leaves. And so there's a lot of complexities in our forests, but healthy, productive forests will help with the soils the most. We actually know that trees, not only from dropping their leaves or little fine branches, dead wood that makes its way in the soil, but trees actually exude carbon from their roots. So live trees will actually secrete carbon molecules to sort of feed mycorrhizae and other organisms. So really productive trees, you're going to get more of that input. I'll say with soils, the most important thing is do no harm. Because of how hard it is to rebuild the carbon, really being mindful of damages. So that's anything where you see rutting, compaction, erosion, really limiting those impacts. So when we're out in the woods with any equipment, dry soils, frozen soils, as much as possible, avoiding wet areas, and then places where we see erosion, doing interventions to control that erosion is really important.
So the timing of harvest can be very important and should be considered as part of the
and also,
program.
trail use, recreational vehicles in the woods, all of that stuff, even foot traffic can affect that.
Okay. All right. A question from Chris. Shouldn't the majority of trees be harvested at their peak age and before they decline? Thoughts on that?
So this is, again, thinking about multiple objectives in our woods, having an eye towards the ecosystem and the ecosystem functioning. We know the importance of having big, large trees. It's one of these things called continuity that has come up in ecological processes in forests, is we want to have things that continue through and past the forest management. So we're not taking everything out of the forest at once. Big, large trees are a source of locally adapted seed and pollen. So if you really want the best regeneration, leaving those is critically important. And of course, as trees sort of decompose from the inside, die, they're incredibly important for wildlife habitat. There's a lot of organisms that are cavity nesters that need those hollows in those trees to survive, rear young, etc. And so, focusing, switching the focus, and I think this is part of, adding the ecological lens and the climate lens of thinking about the forest holistically, is in a timber harvest, there are going to be things you might want to think about leaving and not harvesting for those functions that will help the forest with resilience and health into the future.
Okay. And so then related, let's see here. Okay, this was the part I thought that you haven't really covered yet. Thinking about species to replant, how long after harvesting sort of trauma or disruption would you consider replanting?
So the best option is to rely on natural regeneration if possible, because it's going to be easier and cheaper. So, and that's why I say, like, thinking about leaving big trees that are seed producers, especially near a gap that you might create with forest management, is really key. Or releasing areas that already have established regeneration, taking out the overstory. As far as replanting, it can be a good option for places where you have regeneration failure, or you want to increase the species diversity. So our folks doing this in Vermont, especially with oaks and hickories, and those are two species we think are going to be a little bit more favored in a future climate in Vermont. They're species that sort of exist in southern Vermont, but not, they're warm loving species. So there are folks that are doing that. It is costly and time consuming because you do have a lot of issues. Certainly deer love to eat whatever you plant. You can have weather events just depending on when you plant them. They're really vulnerable to drought and high summer temperatures, can be really problematic. You can have, there's so many number of things. And so really the rule of thumb is about, maybe 50% of your planted sapling seedlings will survive. Really depends on a lot of factors. And so that, if you're willing to do that, that's fine. So thinking about when to plant sort of depends on, what conditions you have and what species, but, you can plant and how much, space you have. You can plant right after a harvest. You can plant the following year. You probably want to get those in there before the other things come in that are there, or your stump sprouts happen because they'll grow very vigorously. And thinking about ways potentially to protect those species if that's a concern. The other challenge we have in our region is seed stock and seedling, nursery capacity. So finding local sources of the plants you want to put out can be challenging as well. So, ask around in your area where folks are getting those, to be thinking about, having something that's adapted to those future conditions.
Great. Okay. We'll just take a couple other questions here. If folks have to leave, we understand we are at an hour, but we'll try to quickly get to each of them if folks can stick around. Megan asks, how does the rate of sequestration compare for individual tree age versus stand age? And how does age diversity in a stand affect this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is a big difference, and this gets confused a lot when we talk about carbon, the difference between carbon in a tree and carbon in a forest. And so carbon in a tree really does increase. It depends on how much space that tree has to grow, so the competition around it. But that really does, increase throughout its life. A tree is always sequestering carbon because trees need to continually grow. It's part of their physiology. They need to really put on a new ring of growth because that's where they conduct their water and their sugars. That's the sapwood that they use to survive. And so trees can survive on not putting a ring on for 1 or 2 years, but most of them need to grow. And so when we see trees that are not adding wood, not sequestering carbon, it usually means they're on their way out. And so we've seen that, trees well into the, hundreds of years old will continue to sequester carbon. And so that is different, and they'll continue to be large stores of carbon. And we think about a tree, it's 3-dimensional too. So, as we increase the diameter, it's a exponential increase in the storage of carbon because of that complexity and that size of the carbon in the tree. Because we actually measure the volume of the tree, and then we sort of do some complex mathematical things to get the weight of carbon. So we're actually convert from volume of the tree to the weight of the tree, and then half of the weight of a tree is carbon, more or less. And so that's how we get to the carbon.
Complicated accounting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's a couple other things here. John notes that more than 18% of Massachusetts state forest lands currently are dominated by insect-killed standing dead trees that are not actively storing carbon and actually releasing carbon on an annual basis. So comment there. Josh had shared the link to the TNC Resilient Lands Mapper, so we can distribute that also.
Right.
And then there's a question from Lena that's, I think maybe will be our close to last one. Do you have a sense of the proportion of New England family forest owners who are interested in passive versus active management? Is it an equal proportion, or is one more popular than the other?
That's a good question. I don't know that anybody surveyed what landowners want to do. That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that. I think it probably varies by state and location, and sort of what programs people are enrolled in. Here in Vermont, we have the use value appraisal program, current use, which is an active management program, although we're adding a new reserve forest category to that program. And so it will be interesting to see what enrollment we get in that new program.
Okay. Great. Am I missing other questions? Sophie and Megan, I think we've covered most of them. There are some comments here. Folks suggesting plant. Let's see. Asking about the painting for your cool background.
Oh, it's not a painting, it's a photo,
yeah.
but
Yeah, okay.
if you want to paint it, that'd be great.
Okay. And there was a question about continuing education credits. We can look into that. We didn't request this for CEUs in advance, but perhaps it would qualify. So we can distribute that if folks are interested in our follow-up email.
It looks like there's a question about leakage.
Yes. Okay. I know you kind of touched on that, but maybe if you can.
I don't know what the question was.
Well, it was a definition. Can you explain it?
Okay.
And I know you kind
so
of
leakage
did,
is this idea that we're sort of not in a bubble, right? We have decisions we make on our forests to maybe not harvest as much. So this is a term that came out of the carbon markets world because they had to quantify sort of the effects of harvesting elsewhere. So leakage is this idea. So say I have a parcel of land and I used to harvest timber from it, but I'm not going to anymore. But that timber will come from somewhere else likely because the market demand has not decreased. And so this is really something I think there was a question there about like, what does the average citizen do? I think thinking about our resources, how we use them, the recyclability, right? What do we do when resources come to the end of their lives? Where do we get our resources from? I think is really critical for us to think about. I don't have all the answers to that, but what can happen is that we harvest that wood elsewhere. And so that carbon that I was hoping to store on my woods, which is stored there, is then being depleted elsewhere. And so when we do the accounting, because of course, climate change is a global issue and the atmosphere is global. So, you know, when we do the accounting, if I store more, but there's less stored over here and it was emitted, then those two sort of negate each other. And I also worry about sort of the out of sight, out of mind part of that, of we have really great forest management, we have good regulations here. How can we talk about forest management in a way that increases its sustainability rather than sort of pushing it elsewhere?
Okay. Great. So someone did share trees from seeds on Facebook, so folks can check that out if they're interested. There's a comment about damp north-facing slopes metabolize litter faster than dry south-facing slopes. Poorly drained anaerobic sites can emit methane, not just forest type, a combination of site conditions as well, was a comment. And yeah, there's many ways people can get involved in their communities in tree planting. There's a lot of work happening across the Commonwealth, I know now, with efforts to do that. So we will try to share some links to all these resources that folks have put in the chat. But I think as we're after 1 o'clock, we'll wrap it up here. So thank you everyone so much for attending, and Allie for sharing your expertise with us today. It was really wonderful. And we will again be in touch by email just to share the recording. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.